Hello and welcome back to our series of lectures on the Exalted Treatise on the response of the Tao, the 太上感应篇. Today we'll focus on the second sentence here, which is still in this very long section on misdeeds. And the sentence is being shameless on escaping punishment. So essentially, this is when we've done something wrong, and we know that we've done something wrong, and we really, because of that misdeed, we should be receiving some sort of fine, penalty, punishment in terms of criticism or warning. So it's not necessarily, a criminal offense, but you know that you've done something wrong and you should experience the consequences. Now, what happens is that you actually get away with it. How would you feel if you knew you've done something wrong, but you ultimately don't experience the consequences? Well, most people would feel relieved. But it's sort of what happens next that's most important. So after you avoid the consequences, what's your next thought? Would we reflect on how it was that we got ourselves into this very messy situation, and how is it that I can avoid this in the future? So that's one path. The other path is to simply just forget about it, just thank our lucky stars and never think about it again. The first option, or the first path, is that of feeling shame, feeling that guilt, and using that to motivate yourself to think of ways to change. Whereas the second option or path was forgetting about it, and that's this idea of being shameless. So being shameless when you've avoided some sort of punishment or consequence. And you'll notice here that this is quite a specific misdeed, isn't it? Because in a way, you've already done something wrong. That is the first misdeed. But when you don't reflect on yourself, when you don't feel that shame and then you don't change, that's in itself a second misdeed. So that's what this sentence is trying to describe here. In a way, it's a double misdeed, this double demerit in a sense, because you've already done something wrong, but then after that you don't reflect, you don't feel that shame. So therefore, that in itself is misconduct. So I think that we have to be very clear that this in itself is a specific misdeed. Now, some of you might say, well, then, given that this shame is so important, how would we define it? Well, if you look it up in any dictionary, just generally shame, okay, it's that feeling of discomfort or like a pained feeling inside. And that comes about when we're aware that we've done something dishonest, dishonorable, improper. You just know that we've done something wrong. And it's this feeling of guilt or discomfort inside. So that's generally what everyone would think about when we're talking about shame. Now, I want to also mention that this is specific or distinct from what we might talk about in psychology these days, of a kind of chronic or toxic shame, which leads to very poor levels of self-esteem. We're talking here about this kind of acute, so short-term pang of guilt that then sort of motivates you to think and reflect and change. So that kind of shame is productive. It's positive, as opposed to the negative, long-term, poor self-esteem kind of shame. So that's a bit different here in the context of the Exalted Treatise. And particularly when we look at the Chinese word for shame, you'll understand. So this is the Chinese character, for shame, you'll notice that it's made up of two parts, the left part and the right part. And they're actually two pictographs. So both of these parts are meant to represent two things. So on the left is the character for ear. Okay, and you'll see at the bottom, I've put the seal script. So the ancient way of writing the ear was meant to look like the ear, from the outside appearance. And the character on the right is meant to be a pictograph for the heart. So again, here at the very bottom, I have the ancient seal script, and it's meant to look like, the heart with its pericardium, that the tissue or the sac enveloping the heart muscle. So these are two sort of ideas, and they're sort of put together in this particular word to represent this feeling. Okay, so it's anytime you see a character with the heart pictograph, it's something related to our thoughts, our feelings, something inside. Now, why the ear? How does that come together? Well, in this particular depiction, it shows an adult, as a parent, telling the child off. The child is sulking with their toy. And then, when the child realizes that they've done something wrong, what happens is that a common phenomenon that the ancients noticed was that when people become embarrassed or ashamed, their ears become red and flushed and hot. And therefore, they thought that this was an ideal way to depict or express that concept of shame. It's this feeling inside. How are you meant to sort of describe it? Well, through its manifestations. We blush, our ears blush, flushed, and therefore they use that to put together this particular character. So that makes it very easy to remember how to write this character. On the left is the character for ear, and on the right is the character for heart. When we feel and we become aware of the fact that we've done something wrong, then we have this manifestation of your ears becoming quite flushed, your face becoming flushed, etc. So in a way, the Chinese character itself helps you to think about shame and what this actually means. Now, where does this feeling actually come from? This shame? From both the Confucian and the Buddhist scriptures, or the texts, the classic texts, it explains that this sense of shame is innate. Everyone's born with it. You don't need to learn, but you will be able to feel this sense of shame. So in the Mencius, so Mencius was the second sage, so to speak, second only to Confucius, lived 100 years after Confucius. And we could say now that the Confucian teachings were very much based on these ideas of Confucius and Mencius. So Mencius represents this early Confucian thought. And he was the first to really put forward the idea that there are virtues that are innate, that we're born with. And here he talks about the 4 virtues of humanity, rightness, propriety, and wisdom. So humanity is this sense of compassion. You feel this empathy or sympathy with others when others are suffering. You can't bear to see them suffering. And then, if you develop that, then you will develop and cultivate your own humanity. This virtue of rightness is best understood as a feeling of shame when we do something dishonorable, but also it's the courage to do what is right. And so therefore, rightness as a virtue is that that idea of doing what is right at the right time. When you're called upon to do something you know it should be done, then you don't shirk that responsibility and you do your duty. And that's that idea of rightness. It's a virtue in itself. Propriety, or sometimes known as ritual propriety, is that sense of respect and humility towards others. And you feel this naturally when you see others perhaps who are more senior, who are more experienced, and you naturally show deference. And if you cultivate that, then it's that fully fledged virtue of propriety. And then ultimately, wisdom is being able to differentiate between right and wrong, making the right judgment, having that sense of reasoning. So these four were what Mencius proposed as four virtues that are innate to human nature. And you'll notice that he talks about these sprouts, right? Just like the picture here, the sprout. And the sprouts are what he talks about as feelings or emotions that help lead you to develop the fully fledged virtue. So yes, we all have these incipient potentials or tendencies towards compassion, rightness, propriety, and wisdom, but we have to develop that through the sprouts. And if you look at the sentence on rightness, the sprout of rightness is the feeling of shame. So that is what Mencius says is innate to us. And similarly, when you look in the Buddhist tradition, so the doctrine of mere consciousness, 唯识论 or 成唯识论, was actually compiled by Master Xuanzang. So I'm sure all of you have heard of the great adventure of the journey to the West, the monk traveling to the West. And that is a fictional story, but it was based on the travels, the journey of Master Xuanzang, who traveled all the way to India to study and understand the Buddhist sutras. And after he did so, he returned to the Chinese Empire, at the time was the Tang Dynasty, and began a very long career in translating the texts that he'd brought over for the benefit of the Chinese audience. And particularly the emperor also commissioned him to translate these texts. So other than translating the sutras, he actually compiled this treatise, this doctrine of mere consciousness, and it was then the founder of the school of the consciousness only school, or the Yogacara school of Buddhism, which is a very fundamental sort of theoretical understanding of Mahayana Buddhism. And when you look at this, it's very clear. He sort of presents what these mental states that humans have. And we have 11 wholesome or virtuous mental states. So these mental states are, mind, so it's from within, in the same way as what Mencius was talking about, that idea of virtues inside, but it's also innate. And one of these is the sense of shame. So this is one of the 11 innate virtuous mental states, according to the Buddhist Yogacara tradition. So here it talks about, well, what is this sense of shame? Well, it is to revere and respect good dharmas. And this respect and reverence is innate. So through our own innate power, we have this power to do so, but also when we learn from the Buddhist teachings, the so-called Dharma. So you can see here that this, from the Confucian and the Buddhist tradition, it explains this innate sense of shame. It doesn't have to be learned, but even a child will be able to know. I don't know if you've ever seen a very young child tell a lie, right? And when they do that, you can tell from their facial expressions, from maybe they start blushing, they don't have to be hooked up to a lie detector, but you can, their pulse is racing, and they feel ashamed because they know that what they're doing is actually wrong. But they really want that lolly, or they really want something, and therefore it leads them to tell a lie. But inside they feel guilty, and they know that what they're doing is wrong, and that sense of shame is not taught. Similarly, you don't need to necessarily read these scriptures, these classics, to be able to understand this. There's a very good passage in the Confucian classic called The Highest Learning, which I've extracted here. And it talks about how, a petty person, so this is a person who doesn't cultivate, doesn't learn about these classics, these teachings, and they just do whatever they want. So it says here, they conduct misdeeds when at ease. So they do what they want. There's nothing that they may not do. They go to any lengths to satisfy themselves and their own interests. But however, when they are observed by an exemplary person, an exemplary person is a person who is actually actively cultivating their virtue. That this is someone who is reading the sage teachings. They want to improve themselves. They're on that journey. Okay? So they're not a sage yet, but they're on that journey. And so when the petty person comes into contact with an exemplary person, what do? Well, they will try to conceal their misdeeds and try to show their strengths, show that they have virtues to boast about themselves, maybe change the way they sit and act, etc., to show that they too can be a virtuous person. And then it says ultimately that actually there's no use because it's quite obvious to everyone that they're just putting on an appearance. But the point here is, and what I've underlined, is that the petty person doesn't necessarily need to have read any of these classics, any of these teachings. But yet, when they come into contact with someone who is virtuous, they immediately feel ashamed. And their reaction to that emotion is to try to conceal their misdeeds and try to bring up, their virtuous side. But obviously, this is only a superficial appearance. It's not something that's long term because they haven't changed inside. They've only tried to change their, how they talk and how they act, but not really their thoughts. But in actual fact, the exemplary person hasn't done anything, hasn't criticized them, hasn't provided any punishment. But the petty person, it's their conscience talking, isn't it? When they see the other person, it's like a mirror that shows up their own imperfections, their own misdeeds, and they feel that they need to change. And that feeling, that response of trying to conceal themselves, etc., is that feeling of shame, this sense of shame. So the sense of shame, yes, it's innate to us. We all have it. Whether it's Mencius talking 2,000 years ago till now, or whether you're Chinese or you're not, this sense of shame is innate to humanity. But it comes out when we have, and it's triggered when we have contact with the good. Now, when I talk about the good here, it could be, as it says in the highest learning, when you observe or are observed by others. And then that naturally sort of triggers that sense of shame, because you know that others are looking at you. But also it's triggered when you come into contact with people who are doing the right thing. Right? It could be our friends, our colleagues, our family members, teachers, etc. And when you sort of when you interact with these people, they may not necessarily point out your faults, but through their actions, you realize, why didn't I think of that? Why didn't I do it that way? And they did it that way. They were able to, do that task in such a detailed way, and in such a careful way. Why was I so sloppy? You sort of it gives you a point of comparison, a reference point, so to speak, a standard by which you measure yourself. And then you realize that you've fallen short. And that's when you start to feel that, there's something that I need to do more. So when I say come into contact with the good, it could be people around you, okay, so your family or others, but also it could be when you come into contact with records of those exemplars of the past. So it could be when you're reading, when you watch a movie or something, and there's an exemplar, a role model there. So it could be people in the past as well. Just like when we read the Exalted Treatise, these are the words, like the highest learning here. These are the words of the sages. They're not just sort of casual observations. These are sort of words that have been sort of distilled and learnt throughout the generations, and it's inspired so many generations. So these are quite important records of the words of those who walked further along this path. So these, when we come into contact with these works, that also helps us reflect and then sort of trigger the sense of shame or feeling that maybe we haven't done as what we should, and therefore we need to change. But also, the good is not just in people, in documents, records, but also in Mother Nature. When we feel depressed or we're going through a tough time, we're thinking about ourselves all the time. Why is it that people have bullied me, or I've been wronged in some way, and sometimes you walk out into and observe a natural scenery. I remember when I was in my university days. I was living away from home in a lovely place called Tasmania, and whenever I missed home, I would often. I was very lucky to be living in such a beautiful place and to walk to, say, for example, in Hobart, the Elizabeth Street Pier, where you just see the docks, you see the water, you see the mountains. When I was in Launceston, I would often take walks to Cataract Gorge, and you just see the great valleys, and you sort of see that this is Mother Nature. It's able to accommodate everything. It's so immense and expansive, and our greater scheme of things is just something very small. So we shouldn't really be too preoccupied with ourselves. We should think more about the bigger picture, and that sometimes breaks up that rut. Gets you out of that rut when you look at the bigger picture, and there's nothing that triggers that better than when you look at Mother Nature. So contact with the good can also help trigger this emotion, and you feel a sense of shame that, why have I been so selfish? Why have I just thought about myself, when really there's so much more to life. So you can see from this general discussion the importance of shame and the reason why these different, whether it's the Taoist texts, the Confucian texts, or the Buddhist texts, really highlight this emotion or this virtue, so to speak. If we go back to the Mencius, he said that a person must not be without shame. So it's essential to being a human. And sometimes, if you see the translation here by James Legge, it's quite interesting because it's exactly as the Chinese says, sort of this double negative, the must not and without. And when we read literary Chinese or classical Chinese, it often has these sort of sentence structures, which is not meant to make it more complicated, but actually it's meant to emphasize the point that it's telling you, emphasizing that you should not be without. In other words, you must have this sense of shame as a human being. And so that's why there's this negatives to really emphasize the point. So, someone who is ashamed of having been without shame. So then there's this word play where you're sort of looking at the different words, the ashamed and shame, and therefore not have occasion to be shamed. Essentially, it's saying that if you are aware of your sense of shame, then it improves you, and therefore you don't find yourself in the same situation again, the same sort of sticky situation where you might feel embarrassed, uncomfortable, etc. And really, who wants to be in that situation? So we have to find ways around it. We have to try to change so we don't encounter it again. So that sense of shame is important. In the following passage, in the same chapter, actually, Mencius goes on about this sense of shame again. He says the sense of shame is of great importance. It's critical to being human. But then he says, well, someone who thinks that they're really clever, they're really intelligent, they're very manipulative, they do things shamelessly because they're only really thinking about themselves. They're not really, taking heed of that, their conscience talking to them anymore. They're just thinking about these scams, etc. But if someone is unashamed that they are inferior to others, then how can they ever improve themselves and become equals to others? In other words, if you don't take heed of this feeling inside, when you see someone who's better than you, whether it's in some sort of skill, academically, in sports, or more importantly, at a moral level, that they're doing something better in a better way, if you don't feel that, then how can you ever improve yourself? How can you ever then become their equal, but also be better than them? So this is the same, not just for, now this is not just for virtue. This is actually just for anything that we're learning, whether it's maths or, something at school, whether it's outside of school, if you're doing something extracurricular, and you're learning some skills, or working in a team. When you see people who are better than you, you want to try to emulate them, and you admire them. Then you realize where you've fallen short, where you have much to improve on, and that's what sort of gets you going, and motivates you. So that's why this sense of shame is so important, is because it motivates you. It's this internal motivator. You don't need to wait for punishment, for consequences, for your health to suffer, or for your family or friends to suffer from the consequences of your actions. This sense of shame motivates you to change before all of that happens. And therefore it's essential. We need to, part of, understanding this is therefore picking up on the early signs, being alert and aware when we feel this shame. So when might we be feeling this? Well, when we feel uncomfortable with the situation that we find ourselves in. When we feel that we want to conceal our actions from someone, conceal what we've done. Perhaps, what's on our computer, something like that. When we try to make excuses for ourselves, when you start thinking that you need to make an excuse, that's when there's a sign that you're ashamed of something. You want to hide something. And then also this feeling that you hope that no one finds out about something that you've done. But all of these are really symptoms of this sense that you know you've done something wrong. And I'm sure that that we can all think of other sort of symptoms as well, but these are some common ones. But rather than sort of sweeping it under the carpet and going along by making up an excuse and, getting away with what we're doing that's wrong, or finding ways to conceal our actions like that petty person we read about before, this Exalted Treatise is instructing us not to go down that path and therefore accumulate more demerits, but actually to take a step back, identify that feeling. Ask ourselves, why do I feel this way? What's wrong with what I'm doing? And most of the time, we know, right? Even the young child knows, and they don't need to have read all these classic texts. Then the next thing is to then reflect on and ask ourselves how we can change. What are some strategies? This is applicable at any stage of life. For example, a very common vice or habit is procrastination. And particularly, as a teacher, you know that this happens to many, many students, that, things are left to the last minute, the deadline is approaching, and they come up with excuses. Okay, so the thing is that if we were that student, or if we have some sort of big project that we need to get done, then it's important to think about, why do I feel the need to procrastinate? Don't wait till the deadline and then try to make up something and get the deadline, extended. But if I find myself in that situation, how can I prevent that next time? What strategies can I come up with? Well, if I'm procrastinating because I think this project is too hard, then it's important to ask for help early on. And maybe one of the best things to do is to break up this project into mini tasks. So if you have to do an assignment, how do you find the information? Maybe that literature search is actually difficult for you. Then ask a librarian, and you'll realize there are some very simple strategies, search strategies. So when you break it down into these various steps, it doesn't become so difficult, and you'll be able to identify which of those steps are the roadblocks and how you can think through those roadblocks. If you can't think through it yourself, then you ask for help through a senior classmate, colleague, or a friend, or even a family member, your elder siblings, for example, to really help you think through that. So don't wait until the end. And this is, something that is so important, whether or not you're studying, that everyone has this this procrastination, and then sort of saying, oh, I'm really bad with time management. But actually, it's not about managing time. It's managing your own ability to overcome problems. It's your problem-solving ability, because every project will have its challenges, its problems. But how is it that we can overcome it? So this is where that sense of shame actually helps us improve. Because if we've encountered a time where we're up against a deadline and we're really, trying to ask for extenuating circumstances, if you feel ashamed, then you don't want that to happen again. You want to make changes. You want to put those strategies in place early, so that you don't come up against that. So being shameless on escaping punishment is really a double demerit. Done something wrong and then you haven't changed. So the action is really the good deed then is to identify your sense of shame, to identify those feelings. Don't be afraid of them. Ask yourself, why do I feel that way? That I feel I have to hide or conceal something? And then, how can I change? What are some strategies so I don't feel that way again? That's really the take-home message. Is not so much, okay, how can I not be shameless on escaping punishment, but then how can I change? Okay. So this is the first sentence. The second two sentences are really related, aren't they? To claim false credit and shift the blame. And the second one is inculpate others and let them take the fall. So to claim false credit is to admit to some sort of kindness or favor that is not really yours. Okay, so someone else has done something to help, but the other person has mistakenly thought it was you, and you admit to the fact that you've helped them when you haven't. So you want to claim the recognition, the reward, the credit for yourself, and clearly was not your work. So therefore, this is false credit. And shifting the blame is, shirking responsibility for that particular fault, whatever has happened. And I think that's quite similar to the next one, which is to shift the blame onto others and then accuse others of your own faults. So not only is there sort of two different misdeeds, which are the same sort of mindset, isn't it? Where both of them are deceptive. The first is, it's not your credit, but you take it. It is your fault, but you try to shift it onto others. So it's the same idea that you're just trying to protect yourself. And ultimately, again, rather than thinking about these specifically, let's try to turn it around. What should we really be doing? And I think that's really where we should focus. So rather than claim false credit, we should give credit to others. Rather than shift the blame, we should accept criticism and think about how it is that we can change. To accept blame, give credit, and accept blame. These are the actions. And there are some really great stories in the collected commentaries that I'd like to share with you. The first one is from the late 10th century, and it's about a chancellor called Wang Ceng. And so a chancellor is basically the highest official office in the Chinese empire. So the only person above the chancellor is the emperor himself. This is a very, very important role. Now, this Wang Ceng, what happened was, when you're the chancellor, everyone wants to be your friend, right? And they want you to use your power and your authority to help them out. And so many people would come to him asking for recommendations, promotions, for his, good word, if he could put in a good word for them. And for all of these requests, Wang Ceng would flat out refuse. He would say no. And on no uncertain terms. It's very clear, I'm not going to do this for you. But actually, for the people that he thought were actually worthy and talented, he would put forward their names. And, when they ultimately got the job, when they got the promotion, they wouldn't know that he actually did that because he had refused to begin with. Now, one of the junior officials once said to him, well, why is it that you don't tell these people that, you were the ones to nominate them, so that they actually recognize that that you've been a very important part of their career. Now, this is where we said before that when we read these books and we encounter these sort of role models from the past, we use this to reflect on ourselves. So imagine if you were Wang Ceng. How would you respond to this particular young official? How would you have addressed the situation? Would you have wanted people to know that it was you that put them forward? Well, Wang Ceng replies that he recommended them or nominated them for the best interests of the state. And the fact that they actually were appointed was not really his work at all. It meant that the emperor himself and the government also believed in the talent and the character of this person, and they were the ones that appointed that particular official. He had no authority to do that. Therefore, it was not. He shouldn't take any of the credit. And on top of that, if he was to personally let this official know, then it would mean that he'd be seeking to gain something personally and to profit in some way. Because clearly, if someone knows that you had a hand in their career advancement, they would feel that they owed you something, that they needed to requite that kindness, repay that kindness in some way. But actually, that kindness should be for the government, for the state. You've been recognized for your work, for your abilities, then you should use that ability for the state, for the people, which is what you've been appointed to do, not use your connections and abilities to help a certain person who's helped you. So basically, Wang Ceng was saying that it was not really in his private interests. He was only thinking about the state interests, and that's all that the person who was nominated should know about, that they should be grateful to the emperor and to the state, and not to him as an individual. So when we read that, we think about, if I was in that situation, how would I react, respond? What would I do? And that's how we can think about improving our own ideas, should we ever be in that situation. The second story is, there's no particular name of this person, but basically it's a story about a very, you'd say, a wealthy person who wanted to give a present to a friend. Okay? And this present is quite a big present. It's 1,000 gold pieces. And he wanted to give it to a certain person, but he didn't want that other people to be suspicious or jealous of him gifting, making such a big gift to this person. So he thinks about an idea and how to go about giving this gift so that no one knows. So what he does is, in those days, wine was held in, usually not bottles, not glass bottles as they are today, but in sort of ceramic urns. And so what he did was he put all the gold pieces into the urn, and he sealed up the top so it looked like it was completely new. And during a sort of party, he gave this person this wine urn, which is, just like giving someone a bottle of wine. And sure enough, when the person went home, they cracked open this bottle, but only to find 1,000 gold pieces. Now, this person's quite surprised and comes back to the wealthy person and says, "Where did this come from? I'm not sure. So there's been some sort of mistake that you gave me this wine urn, but actually it's not wine inside. It's actually all this gold." But what does the giver, what does that giver say to the recipient? He says, actually, I just bought this at the market the other day. Not sure where all this came from, this gold. But clearly, in those days, people believed in destiny and fate. He said, well, clearly, you're the destined owner for all this gold. No one lays any ownership to it, so therefore you should take it. It's a new bottle of wine, gave it to you, so clearly you're destined for it, and so you should use it. And that's how he gave these 1,000 pieces of gold, a very big gift, which is, such an interesting way of giving it that it was, recorded in the collected commentaries. Because when we think about, gifting someone these days, we always try to make sure that, whether it's a large or a small gift, we want to make sure that the other person knows that it's us that's given it to them. We want them to be, generally, the feeling is that you want them to be grateful. If you give someone a gift and they don't say thank you, and then they start complaining about the gift, then you feel that, this person is just ungrateful. They just take things for granted. They're very arrogant, etc. But actually, when we think about the general reaction or response or feelings of a person, of the giver, the gift, and you come back to this story, it's really such a, you really see the difference in attitudes, isn't it? This person here is given 1,000 pieces of gold. It's almost like, $1 million in those days, and yet sort of claims no credit. Doesn't want the other person to know it's them, and it's completely it's given without a trace of any kind of recognition. Whereas most people, they give something small and they want to the other person feel indebted to them in some way. So the question we need to ask ourselves is then, why would we want others to feel indebted to us? Is it that we're seeking to gain something later down the track? And maybe this person is in a powerful position, and we know that in the future they would be able to help us out in our career advancement. In those days, this idea of being promoted higher in the ranks of the court. So when we think about this attitude and versus the story, then you realize that we have a lot more to work on in terms of this particular idea of giving credit. So not only is it not claiming credit or claiming false credit, which is even worse. Originally it wasn't even our work. We're claiming that false credit. If it was our work, we're not even claiming that credit, but we're giving credit. So basically in this story, this person just gave the credit to, destiny or fate, and didn't take any of the gratitude, so to speak. And the third story that I'd like to share is again related to this, but more along the lines of this idea of accepting blame. And this is a story from the Ming Dynasty, so around the 15th century. It involves these two people. So the person on the left, Wang Hua, is actually the father of the person on the right, Wang Shouren. But obviously, these are portraits that are painted later in their life, so they don't look like father and son. But Wang Hua was very, very talented. He topped the palace examinations. We know that in the past, in Imperial China, there were a series of examinations if you wanted to join the state bureaucracy. Even just to be a minor official, you needed to pass examinations. There were several levels of examinations, from the district level the provincial level to the metropolitan level, so capital city, and then the final level of examinations was in the palace itself, where the emperor resided, and that was the highest level. And some people never made it to the palace examinations. Now, Wang Hua, he topped the palace examinations. He was ranked, came first. So only one person gets to come first every year. Can you imagine how many candidates there are that even get to the palace examinations? And he topped it. So Wang Hua was very, very talented. As a result of topping the palace examinations, really being the first in the state, he was given a very senior position in the government. Now, the story about him is that during his career, he was falsely accused of something. So he was framed by another official who was apparently jealous. And many people knew the fact that he was actually innocent. He was just being falsely accused. And so many people tried to persuade him to defend himself. It would be very easy for people to realize that actually he was fully innocent of all charges. But he told them that actually the accusation was actually his friend. Okay, so one of his friends in one of the examinations that they attended together, and if he was to defend himself, it would ultimately implicate this friend, who was actually the person who was guilty of that particular crime or offense. Okay, so he explained himself, he said, well, actually, if I try to come clean, if I try to defend myself, ultimately, I'm actually really implicating the other person. So I don't want to defend myself, just let it be. And ultimately, there were consequences to both his career and his reputation. He was demoted. But then later, he was reinstated. So all of this, of course, was recorded in history. And later, his son, who's pictured here on the right-hand side, also became a very prominent official, scholar in his own right. And, years later, when Wang Shouren, his son, was in office, he heard about the story of his father being wrongly implicated, falsely accused. You can see how people knew that he was innocent, and years later we're still talking about this case. And so Wang Shouren, his son, realized that he wanted to clear his father's name, and he was fully in a position to do so, having achieved that level of office. He could simply write a letter to the emperor to ensure, explain fully all of the different the circumstances at the time, what happened to his father, and how his father's name should be cleared. And he actually started writing this letter. But when his father found out, his father immediately wrote him a letter and sent it by express mail. Now, in those days, there was no mobile phones, no email, no instant messaging. The fastest way to get a message to someone was by the fastest horse. So there was an express mail, but it was also by horse. It was still would take days, but less than maybe months, faster than a few months. And so his father wrote a letter, sent it by express mail to his son. And this letter basically said, or told his son to stop what he was doing. Do not write that letter. Do not try to clear my name. And he explained to his son that, in his entire life, he had done nothing that he had ever been ashamed of. And if his son was to write this letter to try to clear his name, that would be the situation in which he would feel great shame. And when he said that, his son immediately knew to stop writing and never really raised the subject again. And so Wang Yangming, his son, later went on to become very, very famous, not just as an official, but as a scholar, but as a philosopher. He was known as the second most important Neo-Confucian scholar after the 12th century scholar Zhu Xi, and founded this school of heart-mind of Neo-Confucianism. But the point is that Wang Hua, his father, knew that perhaps he was in a position to be able to take the blame, take the fall, even though it was not really his fault. And yes, he would suffer some losses to his career, reputation, but perhaps this was something that he could take, as opposed to if he had just explained and defended himself. And the truth of the matter, which was that his friend actually committed the offense, came out, perhaps this would have consequences, much more severe consequences for his friend and his friend's family. And so therefore, he didn't do anything about it. Now, years later, with his son trying to explain or trying to clear his father's name, well, the reality is that that situation had already been passed. And by, again, trying to clear his father's name would ultimately implicate his friend again. So he was not, he did not feel that it was necessary. And these are sort of, taking the blame is that quiet merit in a way. So you're not taking any credit. It was not your fault in the beginning, but you've taken the fall. And this is sort of accumulating great merits that no one really knows about. And in fact, you've been humiliated in the process. You've experienced these consequences. But really, you can see that his accumulation of these so-called quiet merits, merits which no one knows, hidden merits, then sort of led to a very successful family. The fact that his son was so successful as an official, but most importantly as a scholar, really changing the face of Chinese philosophy in late imperial China. We read in Chinese history of various officials, from 2,000 years ago to the present day, many, many officials in the court, but it's the people who really change the thought tradition that are influential in Chinese philosophy. So, and Wang Shouren, or who's known as Wang Yangming, was a key thinker in late imperial China. And you can see that, perhaps this is related to the merits accumulated by his father in sort of taking the fall, despite, the consequences that he had to face. So I guess part of this Exalted Treatise, this section on misdeeds is quite long, but you'd see that we can turn it into not just misdeeds to avoid, but actually good deeds. So in the first sentence we discussed today, it's that idea of really identifying, acknowledging the sense of shame, and then really exploring it. Why do I feel like that? How can I change? What can I do so I don't find myself in this situation again? And this particular line, or lines rather, are related to the idea of taking credit, or avoiding credit, and giving credit to others, and realizing that, rather than thinking of ourselves all the time, think of the bigger picture. So Wang Hua thought of his friend, thought of, the court, and rather than himself. And if we are able to do that, then every day we will be accumulating merits, and then ultimately we'll experience good fortune in the future. It's through our everyday actions and words, but more importantly, our thoughts. When we encounter setbacks, when we encounter difficult situations. Okay, so I'll leave you with those thoughts. And thank you very much for listening, and hope to see you again next week. Thank you.